Hi, I'm talking to you today about unintended consequences, what I sometimes call backwards thinking, looking back at events and learning from them. What can we do better? And where this started was I was talking with a friend about the Deepwater Horizon, the oil spill in Texas, and he was mentioning, what do you think the causes were? And I mentioned that it was one of the obvious causes was environmentalism. And he was like, huh? I'm like, no, think about it. You've got safe areas to drill, like in a 3.1 square mile area in something the size of Vermont, a national park the size of Vermont. We won't let us drill there in Anwar. We push it offshore. We won't let ourselves drill offshore on the easy places along the coasts where we have infrastructure and things like that. No, we have to push it deep water, deep into the Gulf of Mexico, where it's the riskiest. It's like, who knew that increasing your risk repeatedly would result in accidents? Well, I kind of did. And you take that a little further. Now they're talking about banning all offshore drilling along the U.S. so that we push it overseas where they have lower safety standards and more likelihood of accidents. And we'll ship it because shipping oil around has 10 times the accident rate that offshore drilling does. So it's kind of that cause and effect. One thing leads to another, which leads to another. And we got talking about the energy crisis. And this offensive little Egyptian cartoon kind of demonstrates what happened in the 70s oil crisis. We had Egypt was trying to kick Israel out of the Sinai Peninsula and, in fact, drive them into the ocean. We had given Israel some weapons and training, so the Arab OPEC nations took offense. They had noticed the dependence on America has on foreign oil, so they decided to commit a minor act of war, a embargo on us, and hold us up at the gas pumps. It turned out that it hurt them a lot more than it hurt us. But politicians never want to let an opportunity go to waste. So most of this happened under Jimmy Carter. He, very well-meaning, but he decided to fix a lot of the social problems at the time. Reduce our oil consumption, help the poor, increase public safety. And we had all these issues. We had global cooling threatening us. We had peak oil coming by the 80s. We really have about 40 more years, and so on. But he wanted to help these things. So he created all these programs. I only have time for a few of them, but here's just a few that were meant to help with those objectives. Now, the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit was meant to decrease our consumption by about 2.2%, or increase our efficiency by that amount. It actually resulted in under 0.5% savings. There's some that show up to 1%, but they're kind of not taking into account all the negative effects. So the government had only overestimated by about 4.5 times, which I still consider a victory. I mean, they were close. They made an effort. They saved about $350 million in oil over the first 10 years. Okay, that's pretty good. But they cost about $3.65 billion in enforcement. So it's the type of investment where you put $100 in and you get $10 out. Not what I would call a victory. On top of that, before we passed the laws, we had about 70% compliance with our speeding laws, and after them, we had about 90% non-compliance. There were no real difference in accidents and fatalities. At first, they saw a little decline, and they were bragging about how good it was. Turns out that as oil prices go up, people start driving less. When you adjusted for mileage, there wasn't any noticeable difference. And later on, when we raised speed limits, no change. In fact, accident rates stayed low and went lower. The whole thing was unconstitutional. The 9th and 10th Amendments basically forbid the Fed from this kind of meddling. They have to pass a constitutional amendment, which they did not do. And what happened is a group of states got together and sued the government. It took them 20 years to get to the Supreme Court. And right as they were going to win, the Fed gave up and dropped the requirement. I don't have time to talk about all of the public transportation efforts, so I'll focus on light rail. Now, I love trains. I grew up with trains. In fact, as soon as I moved out of the house, the first thing my dad did is convert my bedroom into a giant train room. And trains do help accident rates. Turns out if you're on guided rails, you tend not to run into things, especially compared to cars. The problem is, in the US, we have never been able to convert people from driving cars to riding trains. About 19 out of 20, or 95%, of our train riders come from the bus fares, or people that used to ride the buses. Now, light rail, first thing to know is that it increases your energy costs, your time to get places, and your pollution. People are like, that's not what I heard. No, you heard the sales pitch. If you're in dense European cities with lousy roads, lousy parking, very few people can afford cars or gas, you get great ridership rates. And if you calculate all those riders on light rail, you get something that's slightly more efficient than cars. But in the US, with our ridership rates, you get an equivalent of about 20 to 40 miles per gallon per rider, which a Prius will beat if you've got one person in the car. If you've got two or more, it'll just destroy. Plus, remember, 19 out of 20 of our riders come from where? Oh, they came from buses. Buses were getting an average of 120 to 200 miles per gallon per rider. So we converted most of our people from efficient forms of transportation to less efficient forms. On top of that, light rail goes right through the middle of a city, which causes what? Causes cars on both sides to have to slow down and wait for the trains. It interferes with traffic, and that causes them to idle, pollute more, and waste more energy. So in the US, it's always been a net loss. It's also a reverse tax, or it's a tax on the poor. If you think about it, these light rails are very expensive, and so you can't raise their rates too much or you won't get any ridership. So what they do is they raise bus rates to bring them up to the level of the train rates and to try to compensate for some of the losses on the trains. And then that doesn't completely make up for it, so they have to tax the community at large, which of course burdens businesses, which means they hire less and always affects the poor the most. Plus, there's a whole thing where they get federal and state subsidies, which basically says people in farmlands who are never going to use them have to pay for rich cities' train systems. Well, carpool lanes. Who could hate carpool lanes? I mean, they're such a good idea. Well, other than the 50% increase in injuries. I mean, who knew putting a high-speed rail or a high-speed lane right next to a parking lot would be a bad idea? Well, you know, and even if you put in the concrete dividers, you still have the merger points, which always results in injuries. San Francisco, this is one of the more optimistic capacity penalties, came out as 20%. You just count the number of cars per hour per lane, and best case, you're getting a 20% loss. That's not counting the increased space that's usually devoted to those diamond lanes. This causes more pollution. If you think about it, if the other lanes could be using the full freeway, they'd be going faster, which means they'd be polluting less and getting there quicker. And it's an unfair usage of roads. It basically says if you work odd hours or you have to drive for a living or there's some reason you can't carpool, you don't get to use the rest of the lanes as everyone else. But soccer moms, hey, they're covered. Since they've been instilled, carpooling has actually declined. So they've been completely ineffective at what they were trying to do. California has spent about $2.3 billion on them in the last couple decades. And since they've failed at every goal, California wants to scale up more diamond lanes. Anyways, I hope this just gets you thinking of other things. We did these things with the best of intents. I mean, people really wanted to help. But they didn't succeed at any of them. So can we learn and remove them, or are we going to continue to have them? The only thing they successfully did was polarize people. They polarized like the informed groups that were against them, against the ideologues, the ones that wanted them no matter what the facts were, and either didn't know better or had to lie about them to further their agendas. So anyways, I hope this gets you thinking more about the costs and consequences of things. Thank you.